At Camp Wallace, a brutal military training ground in the Southwest desert, quiet and underestimated Casey Shaw, nicknamed Mouse, faces mockery, heat, and isolation. But behind the scenes, she's relentless, rising before dawn, memorizing the terrain, and mastering every obstacle in silence. While louder recruits falter, Casey trains with surgical precision, preparing for a test that has crushed stronger candidates. Her target? The legendary 6-mile endurance course record set by General Mitchell decades ago. As whispers grow and doubts fester, Casey steps to the starting line, small in frame, but carrying a fire no one can see coming. And then, she runs, inspired by Casey's story of silent strength. Show your support by liking, subscribing, and sharing this video. Join Silent Valor Stories, where we spotlight the quiet heroes who lead by example. Let's build a community that values discipline, resilience, and grit, because true power doesn't always shout. They call that one Mouse. She won't make it past the mud pit, the general sneered, his voice loud and biting, meant for the entire field to hear. The smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth suggested he didn't expect a challenge, let alone a surprise. But Casey Shaw didn't flinch. She didn't offer a retort or even spare him a glance. Instead, she calmly pulled the laces of her weathered boots tighter, methodically, one loop at a time, until they were snug against her ankles. And then, with quiet confidence, she stepped forward, positioning herself at the starting line. The air turned still, expectant. A hush fell over the crowd like a heavy curtain. Dust hovered above the hard-packed earth, suspended in the golden heat of late morning, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. The last few seconds on the countdown ticked away, echoing louder than they should have. And then she ran. Casey Shaw, slight in frame and soft in voice, launched herself forward with everything she had. Her figure blurred against the scorched landscape, arms and legs pumping with rhythm and purpose. She wasn't supposed to be here. According to everyone watching, she had already lasted longer than expected. But there she was, charging headlong into terrain designed to defeat, her eyes locked on the finish line, breath burning in her lungs. Every step pounding the dust with determination. Her heart remained steady. When she crossed the line, the stopwatch stopped with it, 12 seconds ahead of the standing record. The general who had once chuckled at her expense stood motionless, the color draining from his smirk. Slowly, wordlessly, he removed his cap. What had just happened? What force had driven this quiet, underestimated recruit to beat a legend? It was more than grit, more than training. It was something forged in silence. The American Southwest is not a kind place. It doesn't forgive weakness or bend for effort. It offers no shade from the sun, no shelter from the bone-dry wind that carves the land into craters and cracks. Dust storms rise from nowhere, swallowing the world in a single breath, leaving nothing but ghost-colored grit behind. It was in this merciless terrain, at a remote training base etched into the unforgiving desert, that Casey Shaw's journey began. A journey most believed she was unfit to complete. She was 25 years old, but to the eyes of those around her, she barely looked out of her teens. Standing just over 5 feet tall, with a wiry frame that hinted at resilience more than strength, she didn't project intimidation. Her uniform hung a little loose, as if tailored for someone bigger. The boots seemed too heavy for her slight legs, dragging more than supporting. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet, so soft, instructors had to bend toward her just to catch the words. It wasn't long before someone whispered the nickname that would stick to her skin like sweat. Mouse. At Camp Wallace, Mouse wasn't cute. It wasn't a harmless tease. It meant you were prey. Here, dominance was survival. Heat pushed past 110 degrees. Training drills ran deep into the night, through thick, thorn-covered underbrush. The obstacle courses were cruel by design, meant to weed out the weakest. In a place built to break the strongest, being quiet, small, and unassuming made you a target. But Casey never pushed back. She didn't fight the nickname, didn't demand it be taken back, didn't chase respect with noise. She let the words hang, unnoticed, like passing wind. Instead of reacting, she studied. She watched. She listened. While others elbowed to be noticed, she memorized everything. The patterns in the drills, the shift of sand after a storm, where the ground turned soft beneath a boot, where it held firm. She learned what others ignored. She rose before dawn. Long before reveille echoed across the base, she was already running, tracing the outer perimeter of the camp in the gray silence of morning. She stayed up after lights out, cleaning her rifle until it shined, tying knots again and again until her fingers throbbed, committing every inch of the course to memory. Where most saw limits, Casey found angles. Where others collapsed under pressure, she stayed on her feet. She knew what mice did best. They survived. They learned. They adapted. They found paths others missed. The other recruits overlooked her. The instructors barely said her name outside of roll call. But in that silence, in that invisibility, Casey Shaw was constructing something stronger than muscle. She was building discipline. She was forging resolve. And the winds that swept across the hard ground, whistling through the canyons, began to whisper the truth before anyone could see it coming. The mouse was preparing to outrun them all. But her story didn't start there. Long before she earned the name Mouse, long before her boots touched the cracked desert soil of Camp Wallace, Casey Shaw bore a legacy that shaped her bones and sharpened her edges. A legacy not built on glory, but on loss. Not on victory, but quiet endurance. She was born on the outskirts of a quiet town in central Texas, the youngest of 4 children. Her father, Captain Thomas Shaw, had been deployed to Vietnam just as her mother discovered she was pregnant. He never returned. The official files said, missing in action, likely captured, but no further news ever came. His name was carved into a black stone wall in Washington, D.C., etched among thousands of others, cold and final. But in the Shaw home, he was alive in memories, stories, and the symbols that surrounded their everyday life. His medals were displayed above the dinner table. His dog tags rested beside a worn Bible on the nightstand. And the flag, folded tight and stored in a cedar chest, was the center of family rituals. Casey never met her father, but she lived in the weight of his memory. She breathed in the values he left behind, his discipline, his sense of honor, his unwavering standards, all upheld fiercely by her mother. Margaret Shaw was not a woman who bent easily. A nurse at the VA clinic, barely over 5 feet tall herself, she raised 4 children alone, without complaint, often working back-to-back shifts. She set the tone of the household with unwavering clarity. Mornings began at 4:30 sharp, no exceptions. Firewood had to be stacked, water hauled, the yard swept clean before breakfast could even be considered. After school they trained. Rifle practice wasn't recreational. It was expected. It was a duty, an inheritance. Your father believed in excellence, her mother would say, her voice clipped and certain. That doesn't stop just because he's gone. There was no room for pity in the Shaw house, no space for weakness, and certainly no tolerance for excuses. When Casey's brothers teased, she never fired back. She answered them with effort. When neighbors whispered about the family with no father, she responded by doing twice the work, in silence. Casey Shaw learned young that silence was not surrender. It was strategy. And out in the desert, beneath a sky that blistered the earth without mercy, she would use that silence like armor. Familiar voices. She returned instead to the far corners of the yard, where the fading light barely touched the ground, and ran drills on her own, silent, methodical, relentless. Her shadow stretched long and thin behind her, mimicking the discipline etched into her very bones. She didn't need a spotlight to prove herself. The work, the grit, the quiet victories, those were enough. Her hands, though small, grew calloused from constant repetition. Her shoulders, once narrow and overlooked, now bore the weight of gear and expectation without faltering. She built herself in layers, through sweat, through stillness, through the kind of effort that went unnoticed by most but would one day be impossible to ignore. Casey didn't need to outshout anyone. Her progress spoke in ways louder than words ever could. And slowly something shifted. The instructors began to pause, eyes lingering on her for a beat longer. They saw the recruit who never needed to be told twice, who anticipated commands, who stayed late and helped others without question. The same recruits who once laughed behind her back now watched her with quiet respect. Though most wouldn't say it aloud, no one called her Mouse anymore, not because she told them to stop, but because the name no longer fit. She had earned something more powerful than acceptance. She had earned recognition. The desert did not become kinder, nor did the camp soften its edge. But Casey had changed. She'd learned to find strength in silence, purpose in pain, and clarity in routine. She no longer chased approval. She simply became undeniable. In the rare moments she allowed herself rest, Casey would lie on her bunk and stare at the ceiling, the shadows of the past flickering behind her eyes. She thought of Captain Shaw's commanding presence, of Margaret Shaw's quiet endurance. She could feel them in her muscles, in her breath, in her choices. She was the living continuation of their sacrifice, and it steadied her like an anchor. Every ache, every insult, every overlooked moment, they had shaped her, not broken her. And now, as the days lengthened and the trials intensified, Casey Shaw stood among the ranks. Not the loudest, not the biggest, but the one who no one underestimated anymore. Her silence had taught them all to listen. Casey didn't spend her evenings relaxing on her bunk like most others. Instead, she sought out the quiet edges of the base, far from distraction, to train with a relentless focus. Behind the supply shed, she climbed the utility poles with ropes she rigged herself. She built makeshift obstacle courses from discarded pallets and crates, timing every run with military precision. Near the old footbridge by the water tower, she balanced across narrow beams with a weighted pack strapped to her back. She didn't just push her body harder, she pushed it smarter. Every detail mattered to her. Casey examined how her feet struck the ground, adjusting her stride to reduce wear and fatigue. She mastered her breathing, learning how to stretch each breath over the long haul, conserving every ounce of energy. She memorized the official obstacle course down to every step, rehearsing it mentally as though she were already mid-run. Each climb, each leap, every pitfall clearly mapped out in her mind. Her training wasn't loud, never flashy, and never boasted for attention, but it was methodical, unrelenting, and deeply personal. In her battered pocket notebook, she documented everything: how the sand shifted after a rainfall, how the wind changed with the time of day, which slopes drained strength, and which terrain gave brief respite. She constantly adjusted her gear, testing new strap positions, tweaking her boots for the perfect fit, perfecting her hydration schedule. She shaved seconds off her times not through brute force, but through refining the tiny overlooked details that most would ignore. What set Casey apart wasn't some natural-born talent. It was her unwavering purpose. Every drop of sweat, every blister on her feet, every aching muscle was a line in the blueprint of her plan. She wasn't chasing glory. She wasn't out to silence doubters. She trained for herself to uphold the standard her father would have believed in. And deep in her heart, she carried one quiet, unshakable belief. When the time came, when preparation met opportunity, she would be ready. At Camp Wallace, General Mitchell's name was the stuff of legend. Even long after retirement, his presence loomed over the training grounds like a monument. Tall and broad-shouldered, with striking silver hair, and a voice that rumbled like thunder across open fields, Mitchell had once commanded elite special forces units into the most unforgiving corners of the world. His feats weren't just told, they were passed down, part ghost story, part gospel. No one doubted the stories because one fact stood unshakable. No one had ever broken his endurance course record. 3 decades earlier, Mitchell had torn through the brutal 6-mile course, sand, rock, thick mud, sheer rope walls, in a jaw-dropping 22 minutes. Since then, recruit after recruit had tried and failed. Some were fueled by pride, others by sheer grit, but the course always took more than they had to give. Over time, the record stopped being just a number. It became a symbol of what mastery looked like. So when news reached General Mitchell that a soft-spoken recruit, nicknamed Mouse, had officially signed up for the advanced endurance trial, his reaction was dry and immediate. He set his coffee mug down and gave a dismissive shake of his head. "She won't make it past the mud pit. Let her try. Fantasy gets sorted real fast out there." There was no cruelty in his tone, just the flat certainty of a man who'd seen dreams crash and burn on that course 100 times. He had watched stronger, louder, more imposing recruits fall apart out there. What chance did a small, quiet girl like Casey have? But Casey hadn't signed up on a whim. She wasn't looking for recognition. She hadn't been dared or pressured. She signed up because she had devoted every spare second to preparing for this. She didn't want to break the record. She wanted to honor the standard her father would have expected from her. And when she saw her name on the test roster, she didn't boast or draw attention. Instead, she quietly asked permission to train alone during the evening hours. The sergeant shrugged. Let the mouse have her fantasy. But not everyone shrugged. One observant sergeant made a discreet report to the general. Sir, she doesn't run like she's chasing a record. She runs like someone's waiting for her at the finish line. That comment stuck with Mitchell. He didn't respond at the time, but the words echoed in his mind. In the 2 weeks that followed, while other recruits joked and scoffed, Casey worked in silence. She mapped every inch of the course, trained during cold nights and sweltering afternoons, studied her transitions, visualized every obstacle. She didn't train for cheers, she trained for mastery. By the time test day arrived, Casey wasn't just a recruit trying her luck. She was a soldier ready to meet her moment. And as she stepped up to the starting line, General Mitchell found himself paying more attention than he'd intended. Stopwatch in hand, eyes narrowed with curiosity. The mouse was about to run, and the course itself would now determine whether this was just fantasy or something far more real. That morning, the desert dawn came with a strange hush. The usual gusts that kicked up dust and rattled the tents were nowhere to be found. The air was heavy, still, almost reverent, as if the land itself was bracing for what was about to happen. Casey Shaw stood alone at the start line, her small frame dwarfed by the massive stretch of terrain before her. 6 miles of sheer punishment awaited, not just for her body, but for her will. The sun, still low in the sky, cast long, dramatic shadows across the ground. Overhead, the red digits of the timer flickered to life, waiting for that first beep to release her. In the final minute before the course began, the tension was palpable. A small crowd had gathered around her, their presence a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and a quiet flicker of hope they dared not speak aloud. Word had spread overnight. Mouse was going to run the course. That alone had stirred something in them. And now, standing at the starting line, Casey Shaw faced the culmination of every quiet, uncelebrated hour she had trained. Off to the side stood General Mitchell, arms crossed tightly, the lines on his weathered face carved deep with decades of expectation and discipline. In his hand, a stopwatch. No emotion betrayed him. Then the bell rang. Casey moved. Not with the explosive bravado that had marked so many others before her, but with calm, deliberate purpose. Her pace was steady, precise, nothing rushed, nothing wasted. Every motion had been crafted, drilled, and internalized. She wasn't racing, she was executing. The first mile was the most deceptive, a sea of deep, loose sand that pulled at the legs like an anchor. Most recruits used up all their strength trying to power through and collapsed before they reached halfway. But not Casey. Her strides were compact, her pace measured, her breathing aligned with the rhythm of the terrain. She flowed with the sand, letting it move around her instead of pushing back against it. When she reached the first checkpoint, she did so exactly on time, exactly as planned. The second mile was a treacherous stretch, uneven rocks and loose gravel waiting to twist an ankle or crush confidence. But Casey had studied the ground, memorized how to move across it. While others had stumbled and faltered here before, she moved with quiet efficiency. Every footfall was intentional. Every shift of her weight was calculated. She moved like someone who understood the ground beneath her better than it understood itself. The crowd, once murmuring with doubt and commentary, grew silent. Now they watched. Next came the rope climb, 30 feet of thick, knotted rope that danced slightly in the wind. In the past, others had tried to muscle their way up, exhausting themselves halfway. Casey approached it differently. Her movements were crisp, her form clean. Her legs did the lifting while her arms stabilized her ascent. There was no excess motion, no flailing. At the top, she paused, not to pose, but to take in the view ahead, to draw one breath into her lungs before lowering herself back down with equal control. Then came the infamous fourth mile, the mud pits. Deep, clinging earth that had broken even the most conditioned recruits. But Casey had prepared for this, too. She'd filled sandbags, dragged them through slop behind the mess hall for weeks. Her body remembered. She kept her motions tight, conserving energy, never lifting her feet higher than necessary. When she emerged from the final pit, the mud hadn't swallowed her. She came out moving, efficient, and free of the heavy sludge that often clung to others like defeat. The fifth mile presented the rope wall, a vertical stretch of tight netting rising 18 feet into the dry air. Many approached it exhausted, muscles failing, momentum gone. But Casey's grip strength, built slowly, unnoticed in silent evening hours, never wavered. She climbed it with an almost eerie grace, every limb working in harmony. She didn't falter. She didn't stop. Then came the flat ground, the final stretch, the finish line ahead, and the red numbers of the timer blinking urgently into the heat-hazed sky. Voices rose again from the sidelines, louder now, full of disbelief that had started turning into awe. Casey's breathing remained even. Her legs were still sure. This moment, the last push, was what she had built toward all along. Not just to finish, but to finish strong. She'd timed it, reserved for it, prepared for this final display. The air shimmered with tension as she surged forward. General Mitchell's hand hovered above the stopwatch, no longer skeptical. His eyes were narrowed not in doubt but in focus. He was watching now, not as a judge, but as a witness. And then, she crossed. The stopwatch stopped. The desert fell into absolute silence. Casey Shaw stood just past the finish line, dust curling around her boots, her chest rising and falling in steady, deep breaths. All eyes locked on the timer above. 21 minutes, 48 seconds, 12 seconds faster than a record that had stood untouchable for 30 years. At first, there was only stunned stillness. Then came the eruption. Cheers collided with gasps and scattered laughter, emotions overflowing like a breached dam. People shouted her name, Mouse, Mouse. Once a mockery, now spoken with pride. Those who had doubted her joined the swelling wave of admiration. But Casey didn't raise her fists. She didn't celebrate like a champion. She bent forward slightly, hands on her knees, drawing in breath. Her eyes closed. She looked not triumphant, but quietly grateful. Grateful for the strength that had not failed her, for the grueling preparation, for the vow she had made to herself and kept. General Mitchell remained rooted in place, the desert sun casting a long shadow behind him. The stopwatch in his hand felt heavier now, not just with metal, but with meaning. His eyes softened, just enough to betray the respect blooming within him. Then in a deliberate motion, he removed his cap. This was more than respect. This was reverence. From one standard bearer to another. Mitchell stepped forward, his boots crunching on sun-baked earth, until he stood directly before her. The crowd quieted again, sensing the weight of what was happening. "Well, Shaw," he said, voice steady, stripped of sarcasm, filled instead with something that sounded like pride. "Looks like the mouse roared." Casey straightened, dust clinging to her uniform, face red from the effort, but calm, composed. She didn't have to say anything. She already had. She held the general's gaze, steady and calm, meeting his eyes without flinching. "With respect, sir," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "It was never a nickname that truly fit." The general's response was slow but sincere, his smile wide and honest. He extended his hand toward her, not as a superior to a subordinate, but as one soldier to another, recognizing the bond that only shared trials can forge. Casey accepted it. Her grip was strong, the handshake brief, yet filled with weight, a silent exchange that acknowledged not just a record broken, but a bridge built between generations. Around them, the energy shifted. The other recruits surged toward her, some clapping her on the back, others reaching for high fives or offering handshakes. Even those who had once jeered and laughed at her were now scrambling to touch a piece of her moment, hoping to share in the spotlight of her triumph. But Casey stayed grounded. She offered polite nods and quiet thanks, her mind already drifting inward, back through every step that had led her to this point. The sun dipped low, stretching long shadows across the training ground. The course, now empty, still hummed with the memory of what had just occurred. A legend was beginning to take root, not of someone merely fast, but of someone exceptional. Later, when the dust had settled and the crowd had moved on, someone updated the course's record board. General Mitchell's name remained, etched with pride and legacy. But now, beside it, facing the same sun, weathering the same winds and grit, another name stood bold and unshakable: Casey Shaw. What had unfolded that day wasn't simply about speed. The course had revealed something far more meaningful: an unwavering character, quiet determination, and discipline honed in silence. It unearthed a strength that didn't demand attention because it didn't have to. Its presence was felt through action, not noise. Casey Shaw hadn't run for glory. She didn't do it for records or recognition. She ran for the promise she whispered to herself every morning, every evening, and every silent hour in between. A vow to honor the people who had believed in her, to show the world that the underestimated can rise, can persevere, can overcome and redefine what's possible. And by doing that, she didn't just break a time, she redefined a standard. She crossed that finish line and shattered something deeper than any stopwatch: the old stubborn belief that strength must be loud, that leadership requires ego, and that only the boldest voices deserve to lead. What strikes me most about Casey's journey is how much it echoes the unseen struggles so many people quietly endure every day. The single parent juggling multiple jobs to keep a family afloat. The aging veteran who quietly volunteers at the local center, seeking no thanks. The neighbor who shovels a walkway or delivers groceries without ever announcing it. Casey's story reminds us that strength doesn't always come dressed in noise. Sometimes it's quiet, it's steady, it's the simple, stubborn decision to keep showing up even when the world doesn't seem to notice. I've known people like Casey. Maybe you have too. I think of a friend's father, a Korean War veteran who never spoke of his service, but who mowed the lawns of 3 widowed neighbors every single weekend without fail. Or the nurse who stayed after her shift to sit with anxious patients, not because anyone asked her to, but because it mattered to her. There's something about quiet strength. It lingers with us, deep and true, once we stop long enough to recognize it. In a world that often crowns the loudest voice, we risk forgetting the ones who carry the real weight. Casey's win wasn't dramatic. She didn't make a spectacle. She prepared with purpose. She endured when no one was watching. She stayed faithful to the values that had shaped her. Work hard, stay grounded, and let your actions do the speaking. And maybe that's why her story hits home, because it reminds us that greatness doesn't wait for permission. You don't need applause to be excellent. You don't need a spotlight to make a difference. What you need is discipline, consistency, and the belief that your work matters. You need to be willing to outwork the doubters, not to prove them wrong, but because you know who you are and what you're capable of. That day, General Mitchell saw it for himself. So did the recruits who once teased her. And maybe, just maybe, her quiet example continues to ripple outward, reminding us all that the world doesn't just need louder champions, it needs more silent warriors. So ask yourself, have you known a Casey Shaw in your life? Or maybe, just maybe, you are one. If you are, this is your reminder. Your work matters. Your effort matters. And someday, without ever needing to shout, you'll cross a finish line that no one saw coming. And the world will have no choice but to pause, notice, and respect what you built in silence. In the days that followed Casey Shaw's record-breaking run, something subtle but profound shifted at Camp Wallace. It wasn't just the digits on the board that had changed. It was the tone, the atmosphere. Instructors, recruits, even visiting officers spoke of that run with a new kind of reverence, not because of the time Casey had posted, but because of how she had done it. Her quiet focus, her relentless discipline, her refusal to chase praise. That spirit lingered in the air like dust after a storm, leaving its mark on everyone who had seen or even heard about what had happened. For the first time in recent memory, the obstacle course was no longer seen as just a grueling physical test. It had become something more, a monument to inner strength, to perseverance forged in silence, to a kind of courage that doesn't need recognition to be real. And yet, Casey didn't bask in the glow of her achievement. She declined the interview requests. She politely turned down every offer for a feature, every chance to be lifted up as the face of something. Casey was once paraded around Camp Wallace as a symbol of what pride and perseverance could look like. When people asked her why she pushed herself so relentlessly, her response was simple and direct. The time speaks for itself. My job is to keep getting better. She never sought applause. Instead, she funneled her energy into helping others. Drawing from her own journey, Casey began volunteering her time to mentor struggling recruits. The quiet ones, the overlooked, the ones who reminded her of who she used to be. She met them in the silence of early mornings or in the hush of late nights, long after the drills had ended. She broke complex tasks into manageable parts, teaching them how to prepare without exhausting themselves, how to drown out self-doubt by simply moving forward. Casey never tolerated excuses or lowered standards. She made one thing clear. The course doesn't care who you are, and neither should your training. To her, excellence wasn't reserved for a certain type. It was available to anyone ready to put in the work and earn it. Over time, her mindset began to ripple outward. The culture at Camp Wallace slowly shifted. New instructors, inspired by her example, began to notice the quieter ones, the consistent ones, the ones who led not with words, but with effort. Recruits were taught to understand that strength doesn't only show in volume or bulk. It can live in stillness, in grit, in quiet persistence. 3 years after Casey shattered the endurance course record, someone else finally broke it. Another quiet soldier who had trained in the shadows, using every one of Casey's methods. And when that recruit crossed the finish line, the first person waiting was Casey. She stood there with a steady handshake and a small, knowing smile. No speech, no fanfare, just respect. After retiring, General Mitchell submitted a formal request to rename the course. It was quickly approved. From that day forward, Mitchell's Run was no longer its name. It became known as the Shaw Course. A plaque was installed, and etched just below her name were the words that guided her life. Let your work speak, let your strength be quiet. Casey Shaw's legacy was never about being the fastest. It wasn't even about holding the record. It was about raising the standard, for herself, for others, for the quiet ones who dared to try. Her example continues to echo through the camp today. Every new recruit who stands at the starting line, heart pounding, breath held, thinks of the mouse who showed them that you don't have to be loud to be strong. Because her story is more than just a chapter in training history. It's a truth that the most meaningful victories rarely come with applause. They happen in silence, built through unseen effort, unwavering focus, and a deep sense of purpose. It's about the parent who wakes early every morning to care for their family, the neighbor who quietly lends a hand without being asked, the coworker who encourages others without ever seeking credit. These are the people whose strength lies not in volume but in values. If you've ever felt like you didn't fit the mold, too small, too soft-spoken, too different, let Casey's story stand as proof. You don't have to shout to be strong. You don't need recognition to lead. What matters most is that you show up, prepare, and keep showing up. So think about the Casey Shaws in your life. Who are the quiet heroes changing the world around you in small but powerful ways? And if you see even a bit of Casey in yourself, don't stop. Keep going. You might be closer to your breakthrough than you realize. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know where you're watching from and tell us about the quiet heroes you've known. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned with us here at Silent Valor Stories, where we celebrate the kind of strength that never needs to shout. See you in the next story.